And right away, we're going to move to a short presentation titled Future Ready Skills, Where We Are in Africa by Miss Inyang Udo Umoren, who is the CEO of Association of Development of Education Africa, ADEA. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Hello, good morning or good afternoon. So a quick one. I'm a project manager with the Association for the Development of Education in Africa, so-called ADEA, mostly called ADEA. So I heard you say I'm a CEO, but no, I'm not. So I just thought I would correct that. Okay. All right. So once again, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. My name is Inyang Udo Umoren. I currently work with ADEA as a project manager. So it's a pleasure to be on this summit, sharing more about our unified, perspective on education for the future. I think we're all in the same boat. We all want to see Africa, reach its explore the huge talents we have in the young people, and our education system obviously needs to rise to the call that we need to ensure that our future is preserved and our children are able to function appropriately in the future that we foresee. All right, I'm just going to give a bit of a background to ADEA. So ADEA is a Pan-African organization which is hosted by the African Development Bank in Abidjan, that's Côte d'Ivoire, and it's centrally made up of partner countries. So pretty much all the African countries and a number of development partners as well are represented in the network of ADEA. And largely ADEA is quite prominent on its convening power, right, and strength, and which we express in a number of ways. So ADEA is a forum for policy dialogue on education. It's also a network of policymakers, practitioners, and researchers. Also enables partnerships and leverages a lot of partnerships across ministries of education in Africa and also key education stakeholders. We also play the role of being a catalyst for accelerating education reforms and building a platform for promoting critical knowledge and skills for Africa. So our central goal is to empower African countries to transform learning, transform schooling to meaningful learning. And I think that's something that we all share. It's a goal that we all share to ensure that we're having better learning outcomes come through our education systems. And we do that mostly by leveraging our global connected partnerships and also our secretariat, which sits here in Abidjan. And we largely work within a network we call Inter-Country Quality Notes, ICQNs. So yes, ADEA is largely around ensuring that African governments are conscious of the needs of the education systems that they run, and obviously for us to see a better future that we all hope for. So I know that there's been a lot of the definition of what skills we need for the future has already been provided, right? From the presentation with Mrs. Adefisayo and up until now, and I think that it's very clear, even with the panel conversations, that there is a lot that we need to ensure that skills are strengthened within our education systems for the future that we want. And this is the future that we want for personal development of our children and also for the workspace. Just taking us a bit backwards from an African perspective, in terms of the background to this, is that we have generally in Africa made improvements in access to education. So that this has largely been around increasing enrollment rates, both for girls, for boys, and within school rates, within primary, secondary, and up to tertiary levels. We've had a lot of improvements in those. They are not probably the most exciting numbers that we would want to see, but Africa has made progress in this direction. However, I think we also know that foundational skills is something that we are still struggling with, right? Where we're still having approximately 90% of children who can't read basic text at the age of 10, and also low proficiency in mathematics, which obviously is really required for us to have stronger science and technology systems within our education system. But then also, what is clear is that foundational skills is the building block for lifelong learning and for workforce readiness. So the things that we want to see in the future, all the 21st century skills that we want to see our children exhibit in the workspace, in the system, in the future, all of those really leveraged need to be built on foundational skills, which is a key focus for a number of initiatives that are currently ongoing in the continent. Now, looking at it from a continental perspective, right? The current agenda that the African Union has released is called the Agenda 2063, right? So this is the Africa we want to see. So this is the future we want for Africa, from a continental perspective. We want to see an integrated, prosperous, and peaceful Africa, driven by its own citizens, representing a dynamic force in the international arena. And who are the people who are going to drive this agenda in 2063? Our children of today, our young people of today. These are the people who are really going to drive this agenda. We do then need to consider more deeply how we ensure that we are building the capacity of these young people to ensure that this agenda is met. And through the Agenda 2063, there are core aspirations and goals that are very targeted. So this is a broad agenda for Africa, but then key to the education system is to ensure that within the aspiration to have a prosperous Africa based on inclusive growth and sustainable development, we have the goal of developing human and social capital, right? So this is having well-educated citizens and skills underpinned by science, technology, and innovation. So we're moving towards a future where there is a lot of expectations around ensuring that Africa owns the initiatives around science, technology, and innovation. We're also aspiring for an Africa whose development is people-driven, right? We also know that essentially the strongest resource of every nation and any nation is its people, not necessarily its mineral resources, but if the people are not strengthened to harness the mineral resources, then obviously that's not useful or helpful. So definitely we need to have an Africa whose development is people-driven, definitely relying especially on women and youth and caring for the children to ensure that they are stronger and capable of holding the Africa that we want to see in 2063. So the goal here is to have engaged and empowered youth and children prepared for the future that we want to see. So the expected outcomes from this agenda is to see more African youth who are mobile, see more new businesses emanating from the ingenuity and talent of young people, and also being able to have a reduction in the proportion of youth unemployment, at least by 15% by 2063. So what should we focus on as Africans, right? And why should we focus on this? Now, this is a call for us to empower young people. Why do we need to empower young people? I'm certain, or I want to believe that a number of us are quite on the same page with the trajectory of young people in Africa, the representation of young people in Africa across global distribution of age, right? So we are seeing that by 2100, so 2100, we expect to have about 4 million young people in Africa, right? And this is really going to outpace the rest of the world. African young people would make a large proportion of the global economy, right? So then if we're going to lead the economy in 2063 or in 50 years or 60 years with our young people leading the global economy, what do we need to put in place to ensure that our young people are prepared to lead the global economy in the next 50 years, right? So therefore, we do need to provide these young people with requisite knowledge. We need to provide them with requisite skills, behavior, attitude, and values. And I know the panel earlier on had talked a lot around what skills that we need young people to have to be ready for the workspace, right? So therefore, we do need to consciously be in a position to provide opportunities for that knowledge, for that skill, for the behavior, behavioral patterns that we need and expect the future children to have. And now we know that really the number of young people who are not in employment, not in education and training within the youth population is quite high. So this is a call for not just education, but for a call for partnerships, right? Partnerships across the industry, partnerships across development institutions. We all need to rise up to work towards ensuring that the children are better prepared for the future. All right, so then from a practical point of view, right, how can industry and other partners be involved in education, right? We all agree that Africa needs adequately trained, relevantly skilled, and holistically ready workforce. We agree that we need to have robust ecosystems that support technology-enhanced learning. And this is largely because we know that the future we are looking towards is one that is largely going to leverage science and technology. So how do we provide the digital infrastructure and strengthen the pedagogical approaches that would ensure that digital learning is embedded in the way our young people are growing, right? How do we move classroom practices to meet future employability needs, right? How do we promote more accountability and transparency? How do we ensure, there's been a lot around curriculum changes that need to be in place. How do we ensure that we have the relevant curriculum and infrastructure for youth and skill development and employability? These are questions that not just partners need to answer, not just industry, but obviously our own African government systems need to collaboratively answer these questions. And then obviously, how do we work and ensure that we're increasing availability and utilization of quality data and evidence for decision making? Now, all the things that we need, connecting education systems to the labor systems, to the ICT systems at national and global levels, all of this require data to be able to make adequate and appropriate decisions around the needs that we need to address for the young people. And how do we address the issues around standardized frameworks or guidelines that need to govern industry and school collaborations? So these are some of the things that industry and other partners need to come in and try to support to ensure that we are answering these questions in preparation and providing platforms that would ensure that initiatives are conceived or put together to address these questions. A number of things from the from the continental space that has tried to look at this have been the African Continental Free Trade Area. This is largely around the needs of Africa to maintain and drive its relevance and its global economic realities. So this obviously, it's connected to what you would call the workspace. So really, if we want to have this free trade area, we do need to have children who are ready to drive the objectives of this free trade area. Continental Free Trade Area. And then central to the discussion we're having today is also the Continental Education Strategy for Africa. The previous strategy is ending this year. So we're starting off with a new strategy that runs from 2026 to 2035. And really, within this strategy, education still remains the basic human right? And the government still remains the main duty bearers for this. Obviously, education remains a top priority for Africa, and we do have the strategy also covers strategic areas that are cross-cutting issues, right? So from gender equity and inclusion, second chance learning for mostly children that have been out of school, having more inclusion around more focus on higher education and TVET, so technical and vocational education and training, which is often not on kind of, would we say it's underemphasized. I think TVET is one component of skills development that has been really underemphasized in our education system, which is something that we need to actively also be mindful of. And then obviously foundational learning, teachers, education and educators and caregivers, all of this are components of the Continental Education Strategy for Africa, which we would call on partners and the industry to support to ensure that the goals and the objectives and the aspirations within these networks are achieved, are supported to ensure that they are achieved. So a few areas of collaboration. So really my presentation is how do we come together? I know that we've talked a lot around what the key skills we need for future, what are the skills we need for future? How do we build those skills? So here I am calling for areas that we can collaborate on, right? Collaborate mostly with the government, being that the government are the duty bearers of the education systems that we want to see and the children that we want to see in the future. So across the strategic areas for the CESAR strategy, the Continental Education Strategy for Africa, we're looking around how do we collaborate on resources to an enabling environment, right? How do we ensure that evidence policies and system management are driving, are made available for the change that we want to see? How do we ensure, collaborate on supporting teachers, educators, and caregivers? So how do we support the government to improve teacher policies, professional development, and accountability? How do we increase attractiveness, for recruiting teaching profession? Currently, we know that there's a huge shortage on the number of teachers required for foundational skills and, broadly for the education sector. So how do we encourage and strengthen the capacity of teachers and general educators and school leaders? How do we ensure that we are applying cost-effective approaches to improving foundational learning, right? That is a huge position for collaboration across. There are a lot of initiatives that are currently happening around foundational learning, which we would want to continue to drive the conversation and ensure that the change that we want is happening, right? There are a number of cost-effective approaches, structured pedagogy, teaching at the right level. These are evidence-based strategies and innovations and initiatives that are currently being applied. How do we build on those? How do we scale those? How do we support the government to scale some of these initiatives? And also looking out for initiatives at TVET skills, at higher education skill levels. How do we collaborate on all of this, especially given that we are trying to create a clear trajectory towards the future that we want to see? So within higher education as well, there are areas for collaboration to strengthen links between TVET and the labor market, strengthen links between the higher education sector and the labor market, and then obviously ensuring that we're expanding access and quality, access to quality higher education within our systems. And then obviously emphasizing on research. We need Africa to lead the narrative on our scientific research, or generally research that needs to speak to the changes that we want to see in the continent. We do need to have collaboration and support for our education research systems. Then obviously for lifelong learning, we need collaborations on programs that would ensure that out-of-school kids are brought back on board and capacity strengthened to ensure that they're also being able to live up to the expectations that we have for the future from an economic development perspective and generally for the continent and the global society as a whole. Then also definitely on inclusion, there is room for collaboration on and enforcing and strengthening gender equality in and through education, right? So these are like the 6 core areas within the CESA, so the Continental Education Strategy, which calls for collaboration. Yes, we do all realize and agree that there is a problem that we all need to solve, but then we do need to also come together to try and solve that as in a unified form. So some of the engagement that ADEA has supported in terms of engagement for basic education have been driving the conversation, convening and creating a platform for engagement around basic education largely have been supports that we've offered to regional economic communities, the technical working groups, and also engaging at ministerial level. So ministerial education meetings for the regional economic communities as well. And then we've held high-level policy dialogues through our regular, what we call the triennial, which is largely a review and strategic development for the ADEA strategy for a couple of years. So the next triennial is actually happening this year, where we would be bringing together all the different commitments that have been made through different platforms and getting more commitment from government to ensure that changes are being made across our, core components of the education system. And then we also support ministerial forums on ICT integration into education and training for Africa, and also driving engagement around digital skills for African youth, and then high policy dialogue forum on secondary education. These are things that we've done in the past, and then we as a platform continue to engage at ministerial level, at country level, to ensure that there's more commitment. And recently, last year, we had the FLEX, what we call African Foundational Learning Exchange, and we had over 20 ministers represented there with commitments at the end of the day to ensure that learning poverty is ended by 2035. So that is one angle that we feel like a lot of partners also need to come in to support the different governments, different African governments, to ensure that foundational skills are strengthened, because obviously you can't have a stronger future and readiness for work if the foundational skills are lacking. So definitely, we also have supported and worked with MasterCard Foundation on the EdTech conference and ministerial forum that held in Abuja last year in July. And on an ongoing basis, we keep trying to provide an opportunity for industry and African governments to engage and provide that platform for collaboration to ensure that we are building capacity of children that we need for the future. So from an early foundational level, how do we prioritize foundational learning? How do we raise its salience? How do we raise and ensure that everybody's conscious of the need for foundational learning? So like I said earlier, how do we enhance inter-country collaboration? There's room for us to adapt and integrate and scale up evidence-based approaches. Like I mentioned, teaching at the right level, structured pedagogy, learning through play. Those are things that we can support. How do we support government to scale up these innovations? How do we enhance the production and utilization of quality data? Now, for us to be able to track our progress, we do need to have quality data. So part of how ADEA is supporting on this is the project we call Tackling Education and Skills Data Challenge. Now, that is driven to support countries, about 30 countries over the next 5 years, to strengthen capacity of policymakers and key education stakeholders to provide and utilize quality data for informed decision making. So cutting across policy development, policy planning, policy implementation, and then obviously measuring the impact and evaluation of the policies that we have. And that project aims to support this government to not just provide that data, but use it more efficiently to drive the change that we need. Then it cuts across all the entire spectrum of the education system. So from early grade learning to higher education. So including every component of education and skills system for the different countries. And then also going back to ways in which we can support. So how do we work together to accelerate impact through resources, right? Intentional efficient spending of country resources and even partner resources as well. So ensuring that we are supporting government to scale up cost-effective interventions across foundational learning and even up to other components of the education system. And overall, how do we increase, work together to increase coordination and integration of partner initiatives? So we all would agree that there are a lot of initiatives happening across the entire spectrum of education systems, but how do we come together and harmonize what we're doing to ensure that the government is not confused, right? So that we harmonize and have each initiative leveraging on the other and building a stronger foundation that the government can work with to ensure that changes are happening in its country. So yes, concluding thought around this is we would all agree, as much as the industry and partners have a role to play, we know that for key educational reforms, the government really is the duty bearer. So what we would want to see is have more leadership, more ownership, more commitment from the government system to ensure that the educational reforms we need to have the future that Africa needs are put in place. We also do need to have industry and other partners supporting countries to domesticate continental and regional education frameworks, right? So we have the Continental Education Strategy for Africa, which we should all work together to ensure that the objectives, the goals, the aspirations are supported and implemented across Africa. Then also we have to support the development of holistic and multifaceted approaches that would ensure that we are addressing barriers to accessing quality education, especially education for the most disadvantaged, right? So if we think about Africa, a lot of the most disadvantaged, apart from the children who are who have special needs or disabilities, are what we need to think about out of school kids, because we have a growing challenge around out of school children. How can we support to ensure that there are approaches that are adapted to ensure that we bring these children back into the system, or at least empower them to be part of the future that we have for Africa in a positive way? And then also, how do we ensure that, can we come together and provide flexible education models and alternative learning paths that will cater for these out-of-school children? So this requires a lot of innovation, requires a lot of, thinking together, because obviously as much as we are united as Africa, we do have our contextual differences, which we also need to take into account as we think about how we support the children for the future that we want. Then obviously, like I said, we need to collaboratively work to strengthen the capacity to produce and use quality education and skills data and evidence for informed decision-making across policy, across planning, across implementation, across monitoring and impact evaluation. And then definitely we can't lose sight of the relevance of technology in education. We can't lose sight of artificial intelligence, which is what we're currently dealing with, what we currently have, and we do need to adapt, and we need to have our children adapt to these technological innovations. So can we work together to ensure that there are harmonized ways in which we are addressing the issues and preparing children for the world of technology, right? Through innovative learning models, can we work together with government to ensure that we are putting together support for EdTech and using that to bridge educational gaps as well? And then as a central point is we cannot do much of this also without improving teacher education and professional development, right? So we do need to work together to strengthen teacher education systems, strengthen, professional development for educators. So cutting across basic education to higher education systems. We do need adequate funding for teacher education. We do need adequate funding and support and conditions for teachers to ensure that the delivery of the pedagogies, the delivery of the learning, the skills that we want is effectively done to the children that we have for the future. Once again, thank you very much for the opportunity to share. Happy to take questions, or at least share more insights on this if there are questions afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so very much, Miss Singh. And because of time, we will not be able to take questions, but you can leave your questions in the chat room and the chat box. We'll find a way of, getting it across and getting the necessary answers that you would need to hear. You did. Thank you so much, Miss Inyang. Thank you so much for the insights shared. I'm very encouraged that Africa is very, there's a lot of hope for us because of organizations such as yours, TEP Center, and very many more that are represented here at the summit. So that's a very good one.